this video, we're going to start off by talking about how sine and cosine and tangent are what we call periodic. That means that sine and cosine and tangent will exhibit or have the same values if you go around the circle multiple times. So notice right here at pi over 6 or 30 degrees, I have that the cosine is root 3 over 2 and sine is 1/2. So just to make it easy, it's cosine of 30 degrees. Well, if I go around the circle one whole time, that would be 390 degrees because it's an extra 360 and I have the same values. So notice that if I keep going around and around and around as many times as I want, I'll always end up back at this point if I add 360. That's true for any point on the circle. It's also true if you go backwards. So if you subtract 360 a bunch of times, you'll end up at the same point you were before, and you'll get the same values. But we're going to use the fact that sine and cosine are periodic in order to evaluate them. So starting with part A, we're going to find sine of 17 pi over 6. And the really easy way to tell if something is between 0 and 2 pi or not is to double the denominator. Because 2 pi, if I want it to be over 6, is going to be 12 pi over 6. So I see that 17 is larger than 12, so I know that 17 pi over 6 is larger than 2 pi. So we have to take 17 pi over 6, and because it's larger, we subtract 2 pi. So we get 17 pi over 6 minus 12 pi over 6, which is going to be 5 pi over 6. Well, I know that 5 pi over 6 is on my unit circle. So then sine of 17 pi over 6 is equal to sine of 5 pi over 6. And 5 pi over 6 we know is in quadrant 2. So I'm just going to make a quick sketch right here. I'm going to draw a triangle in quadrant 2. I know that it's the something over 6. So then this is going to be root 3 over 2. And this is 1/2. The root 3 over 2 is negative because we're in quadrant 2. So I want to find sine, which is my y value. So sine of 5 pi over 6 is 1/2. And I want to do the same thing for cosine. So cosine of 17 pi over 6 is equal to cosine of 5 pi over 6. So cosine is negative root 3 over 2. All right, let's try another one. So sine of negative 7 pi over 2. Well, it's negative, so it's obvious that it's smaller than 0. So you go negative 7 pi over 2, and we have to add 2 pi. So I get negative 7 pi over 2 plus 4 pi over 2, which is going to be negative 3 pi over 2. But we're not quite there because we're still negative, so we add another 4 pi over 2, or another, this is 2 pi over 1. So then you're going to get pi over 2. So this becomes sine of pi over 2, which is just equal to 1. So I want you to find cosine of negative 7 pi over 2, sine of 9 pi over 3, and so on. All right, here we go. Well, we know cosine of negative 7 pi over 2 is equal to cosine of pi over 2. This is because from the previous example. And if I were to draw this real quick, I get that this is my unit circle. Pi over 2 is up at the top. So this has the coordinates 0, 1. Cosine is my x value. So this is equal to 0. All right. Sine of 9 pi over 3. Well, I'm just going to simplify this first. Sine of 9 pi over 3 is the same as sine of 3 pi. And 3 pi is obviously bigger than 2 pi. So if we go 3 pi minus 2 pi, you're going to get pi. So this is sine of pi. Make a quick sketch to help me see this a little better. That pi is right here. So this is the coordinate negative 1, 0. So the y value is 0. So here we get cosine is going to be cosine of pi. And cosine of pi we saw right here is negative 1. Sine of negative 11 pi over 2 is not bigger than 0. So we need to add something. So I go negative 11 pi over 2 plus 2 pi. Well, I also noticed that 2 pi, when I do common denominators, I'm going to get 4. That's going to be negative 7. That's not even close. So I'm actually going to try to add like 6 pi, which would be 3 revolutions around the circle. So I get negative 11 pi over 2 plus 12 pi over 2. And this is going to give me pi over 2. So a negative 11 pi over 2 is actually the same as sine of pi over 2. If this step did not make sense, you can just keep adding 2 pi over and over and you will get to this. So pi over 2 again is at the top. We've done that one. And we get sine of pi over 2 is just equal to 1. And so cosine is going to be cosine of pi over 2, which we saw was 0.